At 3 in the morning, when the city rooflines were a dark soar of lights and the traffic had thinned to a distant, indifferent pulse, Ricardo Almeida unlocked his penthouse door and stepped into the silence he had built his life around. The marble under his shoes was cool and deliberately perfect, veins of white and grey running like a map of everything he had conquered. He moved through rooms that had been designed to impress, surfaces that reflected his wealth back at him until it became an extension of his identity. He had been on a night he wanted to forget, another negotiation that had left him hollow, another partner he had had to outmaneuver. He wanted the comfort of his rituals, a glass of neat whiskey, the drop of a match into the sink where the match would disappear, the small private arithmetic of a man who counted power like assets. Instead, in the dim light of the bedroom, before the expensive linens and the art that cost more than some buildings, there was a human shape under a thin blanket. At first he thought it was a trespasser, someone with the audacity to violate the one place in the city he believed he owned. Then he saw the sweeping cloth of a uniform on the shoulder, the worn seams of shoes under the duvet, the faint smell of lemon-scented cleanser. She slept on her side, a hand half exposed, fingers curled like a question. Her hair was braided, some loose strands resting against her cheek. Her face, in the shadow, was tired in the way of people who have negotiated with a city that does not reimburse them for the nights they trade for its comforts. Ricardo froze on the threshold. The staff at the foot of the bed had expected his fury. They were trained to expect it, trained not only by his temperament, but by the cultural shorthand of a man whose name could make contracts redraw their lines. They stepped back, eyes asking permission to speak. One of them, a young man in a crisp suit who managed the household, began to explain how she had gotten in. He started, but Ricardo's voice cut the air, low and controlled. Leave her! His command landed in the room like a jolt. Not take her away, not call security, not throw her out. 2 words that were small as air but enormous as a choice. He took off his jacket, and with a careful, habitual movement that belonged to both restraint and habit, drew a blanket over the woman. He did not touch her face. He did not check for belongings. He placed another pillow beneath her head that had been in the middle of his bed like a small, surprised island. Then he left the room, and the staff obediently backed away, confusion and something like relief on their faces. No one woke her. No one called the police. The staff shuffled into the corridor, the click of heels and shoes swallowed by the palace of silence he usually kept. Juliana woke with a start to the weight of blanket on her shoulders and the odd stillness of a place that smelled nothing like home. For a second she had the incoherent terror that sometimes visited people who slept in shifts, the fear of intrusion, of misinterpretation. She was instantly aware of where she was, the lost corners of a life she did not belong to, and the same muscle of shame that had kept her small all her adult life tightened in her chest. She sat up slowly, alert for the footsteps that would likely tell her she had no right to be there. The man at the doorway watched her without looking like a man watching someone he owned. His eyes were not hostile, they were curious, and beneath that, something unfamiliar, a puzzled responsibility. He was taller than she imagined when she had been told to hide in bed when they cleaned the guest room hours earlier. He did not look like any of the people who had the power to make her life heavier. He looked like a man whose life had always been made to be lighter. "What are you doing in my bed?" he asked, and his voice had been measured to avoid spectacle but carried enough shock to be real. Juliana swallowed. Her voice came out small, and for a moment she thought of running, of bolting through doors that were never meant to be opened by someone with scuffed hands. Instead she said, honestly and quickly, because lying was a luxury she could not afford, "I'm sorry. I fell asleep. I work 3 jobs. I couldn't get home." It was an explanation and a confession, and she knew a vulnerability she could not afford. He did not shout. He did not call her names. The words in his mouth were not an acquittal. They were a puzzle. 3 jobs? He repeated, as if this were a statistic he had never added to his balance sheet. Yes. She held his gaze a fraction longer than felt safe. "I have 2 girls. The rent. My mother used to help, but—" "He let the staff leave?" Juliana asked suddenly, because the most immediate fear was empty rooms full of strangers with rules to obey. You didn't. Ricardo's laugh was short, a sound that tasted like surprise and something like respect. No, he said. I told them to close the door. In the small half-minute silence that followed, the city hummed under them, indifferent to the new equation placed across its centre. Juliana's body began to shake, but she controlled it with a hand pressed to her stomach. Her throat tightened the way a person's does when they have been swallowed by a system and are trying to climb out. If you call the police, I'll be ruined, she said. It was a simple arithmetic she had learned early in widowhood. The bureaucracy of the system did not differentiate between sight and prejudice. The officers would say she had trespassed, and the paperwork would become a wedge between rent and light. Ricardo tilted his head, considering. He smelled the lemon cleaning fluid clinging to her hair, the faint smoke from the cigarettes of the men who sometimes shared a lunch table in the building's basement. He began to count. Not numbers of property deals, but numbers she had uttered. 3 jobs, 2 children, nights without a bed of her own. The act of counting changed things. Numbers in his world were usually applied to square footage and profit margins. Now the numbers applied to human hours. Tell me how you ended up here, he said. It was not an interrogation the way his business meetings were, formal and practiced, but the kind of question people ask when they intend to hear an answer. She told him briefly. The cleaning rota had been changed, and an evening slot overlapped with a famous showcase the building was hosting. She had been promised a short rest before making the last bus home. She had had a migraine and had lain down in the guest room, and exhausted beyond the margin of possibility, fallen asleep. The staff had been told not to disturb her. Then the night had grown into the moment he found. Ricardo listened. He heard the names, Paraisopolis, Villa Olympia, Faria Lima, in a list that was more geography than narrative to him, and yet he knew them as coordinates on a map of disparity. He imagined a different kind of ledger, one where hours worn thin were visible. When Juliana left the building at dawn, she walked past a doorman who averted his eyes, past an elevator full of residents returning from late meetings. The cold morning air hit her face like judgment. She walked to the bus line that took her through the city toward the neighborhoods where she worked. She did not look back at the glass monolith that housed Ricardo's life. She had no reason to imagine that the man who had found her would think of her again. But the city, being what it is porous to small mercies. Ricardo did not sleep that night. He sat at his window and listened to a soundtrack only he could hear. The distant clunk of construction, a squeal of brakes, the soft rhythm of a metro train. He watched cameras that turned slightly, recorded lobbies and corridors. The building had a network of security feeds and maintenance logs, tools of control he'd long considered practical. Control was part of his brand. Now, for the first time in years, he used them not to monitor property value, but to watch someone who had been invisible in his world. Juliana's day began before the sun. She lived in Paraisopolis in a thin apartment she rented from an aunt who took in others to make ends meet. The rooms smelled of jasmine and cooking oil. Her 2 daughters, Luna with a mop of hair and Sophia smaller and stubborn, slept curled against a single cheap blanket. Juliana woke them before dawn with a quietness that was a learned tenderness. She packed lunchboxes with an economy that made food stretch, braided hair with fingers that had cleaned other people's cabinets and countertops for a living. After a hurried breakfast and the kiss that sounded like a promise, she left for the bus. Work 1. A corporate office in Faria Lima, where she cleaned the small, officious bathrooms and desks that always smelled faintly of coffee and negotiation. The morning clients never looked beyond their screens. She moved like a shadow through glass cubicles, wiping fingerprints off of polished wood, rearranging chairs no one sat in for long. The people of this building paid for technology to minimize human interaction. She provided the invisible labor that made their curated image possible. She had worked here before finishing a degree in administration, but opportunities had evaporated with her husband's death. The degree, a piece of paper she carried in her bag, felt sometimes like a relic rather than a hope. Work 2. A mid-level condominium in Villa Olympia, where residents kept plants in exact rows and expected instant response to any perceived unsightliness. Here she answered to Renata, the cleaning supervisor, who ran a lean operation that rewarded speed and punished hesitation. She shared jokes with colleagues between floors. Bate joked about lottery bills. Jorge once had laughed too loud and been reprimanded for stepping out of line. Lunch was often a sandwich massed in a plastic bag, eaten at a bench, the city rising and falling around them. Work 3, the job that had put her in Ricardo's bed, a temporary shift at the building where Ricardo owned penthouses and real estate portfolios. At night, the cleaning staff made the place disappear from themselves. They sterilized light switches, polished chrome rails, removed the human fingerprints from surfaces that announced luxury. They were expected to be nearly invisible. When an event required extra hands, Juliana took the shift. Money had to be made. Luna's school fees loomed. Sophia would need new shoes by winter. She was not above any lawful work. Pride did not mean refusing to lift a chair to make her daughters sleep under better light. Between jobs, Juliana's life was a collage of bus rides, borrowed minutes on public benches to answer calls from school, and the fragmented peace of a market where voices belonged to those who had not learned to keep them inside. She had lost her husband to a disease that had no courtesy for timing. The grief had been a private debt she repaid with daylight. In the week since he died, she learned how to schedule mourning in quarters, a little at night, a little while waiting for a bus. Ricardo, meanwhile, catalogued houses and policies. He was known in the city as a man who set his jaw around his decisions, a populist for investors and a tyrant for those who crossed him. His company had reshaped neighbourhoods, and his name on a building promised prestige and fierce management. He had built his reputation at the intersection of ruthlessness and genius. There were boardroom photos of him leaning over models of towers, speaking with a voice that made consensus form like fog. But inside his towers, the human geography was more complex than his public persona. He began to notice things. A cleaner who fixed a coffee spill in the lower lobby with curt efficiency. A porter who wore a uniform with too many worn threads. A note from the accountant about overtime entries that didn't match the timesheets. The building's maintenance reports were always precise, yet the people who filled them were often absent from them. He thought about the manila folders in his office, the ones with neat handwritten notes, and realised they represented lives he had never actually sat with. He started small. He called the accountant. "Bring me the cleaning schedules for the last month," he said. The accountant arrived with a neat stack of spreadsheets and a face that drew a lesson in the reluctance of finance to be messy with human stories. They spoke in numbers. The accountant showed him clocks in and clocks out, the overlaps, the missing entries where extra shifts were picked up without compensation. There were signatures that could be faked with the casualness of bureaucracy. Ricardo read them like a man who read blueprints, tracing the path where invisible people walked and left their shadows on the margins. Each anomaly had an explanation, one that the accounting department gave in the tone of policy. He wanted policy, but when he watched footage from the security guard room, he saw more than numbers. He saw Juliana leaning over a marble counter, wiping away someone else's stain with a motion that was practiced enough to be invisible. He saw her pause and help a child who had dropped a lunchbox and not look up when a resident rolled his eyes. At night, between meetings, he would replay a small loop of footage. The way she pushed a cart with quiet dignity, the way she kept her head down, yet kept a straight back. He was not moved by a dramatic narrative. He was moved incrementally, like a tide that begins at a grain of sand. He discovered the metaphorical cost of what he had built. For every surface he polished to perfection, there was a human life that had to fragment itself to maintain it. He had not been unkind before, at least not to himself. He made philanthropic gestures the way one writes a press release, well-crafted and public. But compassion that started with a blanket was rarer. When he covered Juliana with his personal linen, he had not thought about the symbolic weight of that act. His inner life had always favoured neat transactions. Now he was confronted with a transaction that did not fit into a ledger. He felt something like guilt, which made him uncomfortable, then something like responsibility, which made him restless. For Juliana, mornings were rituals of survival. Her work had its own dignity, but dignity often collided with the friction of disrespect. She suffered little indignities. Conversations abruptly ended when she entered a hallway. tips that were imagined to be mutual goodwill but often vanished, the jokes residents made about staff that landed like pebbles against a glass window. She learned to answer with a flat voice until she remembered her daughters who needed warm clothes. Between cleaning floors, she kept a folder in her bag. Her diploma, proof of a credential she had thought would be the bridge to something different. The diploma would rest like a talisman below the bleached napkins and dusting cloths. For a while, when the city pressed heavy against her chest, she would take it out and read a paragraph, letting the words remind her that she had once imagined a life in administration, a job that might be stable and respectful. The diploma did not solve rent. It did not pay for a paediatrician. It served as a quiet insistence that she was not only what she did. When Juliana cleaned in Ricardo's building, she followed instructions she had been given. Do not enter private quarters unless called. Do not interfere with a resident's possessions. Be punctual. Keep receipts for overtime. There were unwritten rules too. Do not complain loudly. Do not argue with tenants. Do not make them uncomfortable. Invisible compliance ensured continued work. She learned the rhythm of the place, how the chandeliers were wiped as if they were fragile chandeliers from a museum, the way the caterers excelled at invisibility by making food disappear with the same grace she used to erase footprints. These were worlds where wealth had its choreography, a self-conscious elegance that made humility look like a poor costume. After the night in his bed, Ricardo's world changed in degrees. He began to attend to small annoyances that had long been papered over with memos. He asked Renata for the names of the permanent staff and the temporary ones. He asked the accountants to show him the payroll ledger. Every answer was a negotiation between what was legally compliant and what was morally comfortable. He found gaps. He found people working extra without documentation because the system allowed for casual human economies that were not visible on annual reports. He did not move to grand proclamations. He did not announce an overhaul at the first sign of discomfort. Instead, he convened a quiet meeting. He called Mauricio, his partner, and asked him to come by after dawn. He wanted to understand the administrative obstacles he would have to navigate if he were to make changes within his own buildings. When Mauricio arrived, the penthouse felt oddly domestic for a man whose transactions usually took place under fluorescent lights. "What did you do?" Mauricio asked, seeing the unsettled look on Ricardo's face. "Nothing dramatic," Ricardo said. "I let someone sleep." Mauricio raised an eyebrow. "You—" He let the question hang. There were reputational costs to such small defiance. The city speaks in rumours and indignation faster than it tallies checks. "She was a cleaner," Mauricio said eventually. "Was she—" "She works 3 jobs," Ricardo said. He watched the mornings move as if parts of his life had been rearranged by a housekeeper's rhythm. He did not want to be sentimental. He wanted to be practical. "Bring HR. Show me the controls. Let's look at how labour is organised in our buildings." Mauricio scoffed a little, but the word presentation in Ricardo's voice suggested inevitability. They scheduled a meeting with the building manager, the syndica, and the accountant. The meeting would not be a spectacle. Ricardo preferred stealth reforms to public grandstanding. But he was aware of a larger set of consequences. The people who benefited from the status quo would not be indifferent to changes that might cost them convenience. Juliana, for her part, rotated through another day. She left the apartment with the same folded determination, kissed her daughters, and reminded them who they were to each other. She went to the day job, ticking off the lists like a machine and turning strangled frustration into functionality. She had been tempted to apply for an administrative position more than once, but then the bills arrived and the timing was wrong. Her diploma was proof both of a dream postponed and of the stubbornness that kept her insisting on a future that still might be. At lunchtime in the office in Faria Lima, she sat with a colleague named Beat, who had a quick laugh, and an older brother who worked nights. They compared plans, swapped names of reliable daycare providers, traded the kind of practical knowledge that acts like a collective ledger among people who survive together. Juliana mentioned, without looking up, the night she had slept in the guest room. Beat listened, eyes going to the outside window, imagining a sky Ricardo's height could not touch. The conversation was small. There was no pity in it, only the quiet accord of people who knew one another's struggles. At dusk, Juliana caught the bus that would take her through neighborhoods of glass and cardboard. She thought of the night the building would host a showcase, a dinner where real estate deals were presented like theatre, and the guests sipped aged champagne while guided tours extolled architecture as culture. She had been scheduled to work the event because someone had called in sick, and Renata needed a warm body with experience. She said yes because no was a sentence that could cost her everything. She would be invisible that night in ways that made her practical and significant simultaneously. Ricardo studied the guest list for that same event. He watched the names of people who had once applauded his ruthlessness in boardrooms and considered what would happen if he forced the ledger to look different. He realized, with a clarity that was both shocking and liberating, that doing the right thing would not always be painless and would not necessarily improve his market value. It might cost him allies. It might complicate investor relations. But it also had the potential to do something rarer, to align the building's policies with something that approximated decency. He had no illusions about the spectacle that such changes could become. He had been in public enough to know how headlines could flatten complexity. But he found himself making quiet decisions, asking HR to come in for a private briefing, instructing the building management to verify timesheets with actual signatures, assigning someone to audit payroll entries. The acts were small, procedural and boring, exactly the things that produce durable change when habit becomes policy. Juliana did not know she had been studied. She moved through the city like a person whose life was a succession of small accommodations. She adjusted, adapted, answered with resilience. She had no idea that the man who had found her in his bed was at that very moment checking guest lists and payrolls and thinking about the moral arithmetic of his buildings. That night, as she prepared for the event, Juliana ironed her uniform with the care of someone who knew the power of presentation. The uniform was not luxurious. It was plain and professional and clean, but to her it was armour. She tucked a copy of her diploma into her bag, beneath the cloth and the tiny bar of soap she carried for emergencies. She left the apartment, kissed Luna and Sophia through their sleep, and took the bus toward Villa Olympia. Ricardo walked into the event with a practiced gait. He saw the chandeliers, the polished wood, the guests who had learned how to broadcast success. The bustle of the room hung like expectation. People who had arrived to evaluate deals were already forming a soft constellation. He saw Patricia Mendez, a woman of society who had an eye for disdain as if it were an accessory, standing by a group of people who were laughing in a register that required no humility. Across the room, Juliana moved like a blade of light polished into a window of competence. She was alone in the way staff are in rooms where the wealthy stream their scarcity. She kept her hand steady and her jaw set. No one had told her to challenge anyone. She had been taught to be invisible. But when a plate tipped and a champagne flute scandalously spilled across a runner, the room watched in the culture's practiced silence. A voice, cool and precise, demanded that the woman who had caused the spill be attended to. The person responsible for the glass was, of course, offended quickly, but the fingers of the room went automatically to the nearest scapegoat. A guest, Patricia, made a gesture asking the server to fetch the cleaner. It was a small cruelty, the sort that acknowledges a hierarchy by making labour perform the emotional labour of cleaning a nervous class's spill. Juliana moved toward the stain with a panache that would later be misread as humiliation. She reached for the cloth and the cleaning fluid as if the room was nothing more than her job, and she had to do it as perfectly as possible. Patricia, seeing her in uniform, made an aside that was loud enough to be heard. "Kneel, darling," she said, with the kind of voice that converted instruction into power play. The tone was meant to remind everyone present of the social ladder, the visible and the invisible steps. Juliana paused. She had been told, implicitly, that submission was part of the script. She had been treated like a moving object in many rooms, like an appliance. Kneeling would have been to accept that ledger. Kneeling would have been to make visible the very shame that made her small. For a second the room held its breath. A chandelier blinked as if the city itself was curious. Ricardo, who had not intended to involve himself, found himself moving toward the scene in a way that felt inevitable. He had watched payrolls and had asked for timesheets and had argued over signatures, but this was the moment that pushed policy into flesh. He stepped between Juliana and the voice of Patricia, with the casualness of someone who did not think twice about intervening in things that deserved intervention. "Enough," he said. It was a soft enough command, but when his voice found its place in the room, the air shifted. People looked at him because they had been trained to watch him. Patricia's smile faltered for a fraction. Juliana stood up straight, eyes fixed down at the satin runner. He did not shout from a moral high ground. He did not make a speech. He simply told the woman who had commanded humiliation that her request was inappropriate and that no one in his buildings knelt to be cleaned. The words were small, the effect outsized. The room rearranged itself. Juliana did not respond with gratitude for the rescue that had been unasked. Gratitude would have made her seem indebted before a man who had power over her employment. Instead, she straightened her back and kept the cloth moving, her hands a quiet argument that dignity can be preserved in the simplest of motions. Ricardo's intervention that night had consequences he had not fully accounted for. It was not a headline. There would be no photograph of his kindness. But there would be an accrual of small indignities unallowed. Heads would roll in administrative records. The porter who made jokes at the expense of cleaners might find himself in an uncomfortable official process. The accountant who had not logged overtime properly could be compelled to explain discrepancies. The building's management would be asked to create formal policies and to document them on paper, signatures, memos, a trail that would make casual abuse harder to hide. The scene closed with the polite clinking of glasses. People resumed their circuits of commerce and theatricality. Juliana finished cleaning as if nothing had happened. Patricia moved away with a face consigning the interruption to irrelevance, but Ricardo had seen the ledger in a way that would not be undone. He had been forced to think about the small procedural things, how a timesheet could invisibilize labour, how a schedule could demand sacrifices invisible to those who benefited. He found himself wanting to rectify something he had not known had been his responsibility. After the event, Juliana walked into the building manager's office to sign a small extra hours slip, mundane paperwork that paid for a week's groceries. She did not know her every move had been witnessed, not just by the building cameras, but by the man who had the power to change the line that separated her from the rest of the residents. The ledger would, in time, change. But for now, the night was simply a night like others. A shift done, a bus ride home, children kissed through fatigue. Ricardo left the event with the taste of something new in his mouth. It was not heroism, it was recognition. He had felt a small shift of priority. What was once tolerable as the cost of maintaining a brand had become a blemish he could no longer ignore. He thought of that night when he had found Juliana asleep in his bed, and of the quietness of her voice when she had said she worked 3 jobs. He thought about the signatures on payrolls and the balance between reputation and responsibility. That night, before he slept, he called his assistant and asked for a private file to be opened, payroll audits, staffing rosters, and a list of all complaints logged in the last 12 months. He wanted memos, not for a press release, but to know what the house looked like behind the luxurious veneers. He wanted data. He wanted to see whether the city's dignity had been traded away in the small print of contracts. He did not expect how many sheets of paper would feel like lives. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. The days that followed were procedural and careful. Ricardo convened a meeting with the syndicate and the accountant. He instructed them to produce an audit. They reacted in a mixture of reluctance and efficiency. Clerks dislike surprises that demand paperwork. He asked to see the overtime approvals and the HR policies. He wanted to know how temporary staff were hired and how complaints were processed. The answers exposed habits more than illegality, habits that allowed power to skim over people and leave them with less than what they deserved. Juliana continued to move through her lives. She started to notice changes she did not understand at first. A supervisor asking for signed sheets for overtime, a new memo on notice boards promising verification of payment. Renata, the supervisor, spoke to her with a clipped formality and slid a paper across the break room table for her to sign. Juliana read it like a contract that might mean the difference between survival and precarity. The words were small and bureaucratic, but their effect might be large. She did not assume the world was changing because of one night. She had been burned by promises before, political promises, empty reassurances from men who wanted to appear humane without bearing the cost. So she checked the numbers, kept copies of receipts, and with a guarded hope that had been earned by endurance, she continued to do her work with the same steady attention. Ricardo's attention to the paperwork was not dramatic. He did not hold an announcement on the balcony with champagne flutes raised to moral virtue. He instructed the accounting department to enforce payroll protocols, required the syndica to sign a written directive regarding break times and documented overtime, and scheduled HR workshops to formalize complaint procedures. He asked for the porter's employment file to be reviewed by human resources because he heard rumours that in his world had previously been small crumbs he ignored. The events were procedural. They were the kind of administrative labour that could remake lives if tasks were followed through. But bureaucracy is stubborn to change, and not everyone in his orbit appreciated the possible headache of enforced documentation. Mauricio mentioned the risk to margins and to convenience. Contractors grumbled. The syndica, who had long managed relations between residents and staff, with a mix of discretion and opportunism, bristled when asked to comply with new oversight. Yet a man with Ricardo's temperament rarely finds comfort in half measures. He had decided, in the quiet that followed the bed, that some systems required repair. For Juliana, the reforms were at first a ripple. She signed new sheets. She took home extra hours compensated with exactitude for the first time in months. She stored copies of her receipts in the same folder as her diploma. She felt a cautious buoyancy, but kept her expectations low. Survival had taught her that hope must move at a practical pace. In the background of these slow changes, a different kind of attention started to form, a curiosity that felt like a friendship between two people who were learning the script of each other. It was not love yet, too soon, too complicated, and truthfully, too bound by the imbalance of a man who owned roofs and a woman who built her life under them. It was the kind of attention that might, later on, be the foundation of something steadier. For now, both of them moved like people adjusting to an altered gravity. Weeks passed. Small memos turned into signed directives. The porter, Jorge, received an official warning after an incident logged by a resident, whose complaint had always been a whisper, until documentation made it a paper trail. The accountant corrected payroll entries when asked, and started insisting on harder verification. The syndica learned, slowly, that she would answer to audits now. She could not treat notes and records as informal instruments of control. For those who had been invisible, the change was more a relief than a miracle. It was proof that a system could be nudged toward fairness, when someone with access said, finally, that it should be. Juliana noticed the practical differences and measured them like a careful instrument. Being paid for hours worked made the week's food bills easier to meet. The new schedule meant that she could, sometimes, arrive home early enough to read a story to Luna before bed. Her children noticed small changes, the purchased notebook for school, the repaired seam on Sophia's jacket. These were not dramatic rescues. They were steps that, accumulated, gave breath. Ricardo watched from his high windows. He saw small outcomes in the life of a woman he had once found asleep in a bed he thought he owned. He began to understand that wealth could be arrayed differently, not as a headline, but as a series of procedural choices. He felt the discomfort of a man learning that a toned reputation required sustained behaviour. It was not a romantic awakening. It was the slow accretion of conscience that preferred systems to optics. The city's nightlights continued to shimmer, indifferent and persistent. Both of them had nights where their plans would stall, a child's fever, a missed bus, a contract negotiation that soured. The work of survival continued. But the bed incident, that single shocking command to leave her, had become a hinge. And yet, as small reforms settled into place, and as both of them began to move through a city with new, tentative alignments, the old mechanics of the world persisted. The social showcase would happen again. There would be parties that invited the wealthy to practice generosity with their finest gestures. There would be people like Patricia, who found power in small humiliations. There would be staff who still had to decide whether to obey or to push back. The moment of collision had been postponed, but not avoided. They both carried toward it, Juliana with the pragmatic carefulness of someone who sterilizes shame, Ricardo with a ledger that was no longer only about profit. When he opened his inbox that morning, the message from the building coordinator was about the upcoming development showcase. Floor plans for a new wing to be presented, a list of attendees, and the schedule of cleaning shifts. Juliana's name was on the list. Patricia Mendez was on the guest list. The event, which had been another iteration of the same patterns, now felt sharper. Ricardo read through the details and felt the thrum of an event that might either flatten dignity or expose it. He closed his laptop slowly. He would attend. He could not help but think about how the night in his bed had forced him to see hours differently. He understood that when two worlds shared the same room, they often did not know how to speak to one another. He had begun to learn some words. He left the office toward the elevator, the city drawing behind him like a second skin. The day hushed into a promise. The city watched, as it always does, indifferent and patient, waiting to see what men with power would choose when confronted with the fragile architecture of a life. The next collision was coming. They were only beginning to understand the terms. They had only just begun to learn how to live with the consequences of a single strange night. The showcase had been a pressure test. The memos and audits that followed would be steadier weather. For a while, life moved in the narrow bureaucratic rhythms that make real change possible. Meetings, signatures, follow-ups, the dull, exact labour of documentation. In the days after the event, the building's atmosphere prickled with small alarm. The syndica, whose authority came from discretion and the old informal bargains of convenience, found herself answering questions that required paper and an account. The accountant produced spreadsheets. HR drafted a new overtime policy and a protocol for handling complaints. Mauricio grumbled about the extra hours the changes would demand and the uptick in administration costs. He liked his margins neat and predictable. Ricardo, who had made an early choice to avoid spectacle, was prepared for resistance. He had learned to count on friction when anything that had benefited convenience for others became a requirement. Jorge, the porter, was the first person to face the new scrutiny. His record, once smoothed over with a handshake and a smile, contained exchanges that would no longer slide. There had been complaints, jokes that lingered too long, an offhand humiliation that had been accepted as part of the job. HR investigated formally. It was not a public firing in the way tabloids might demand. It was a procedural termination after documented warnings, signed statements, and an offer of outplacement support. The emphasis was on process. Written complaints, opportunity to respond, a final review. Jorge left with a termination letter and information about unemployment benefits. He left angry, but he also left with a clear record that would make further redress possible if needed. The syndica received a sternly worded memo, coupled with the mandatory training calendar she now had to deliver. The accountant rewrote overtime approval workflows and instituted matched signatures for extra hours. The changes were tedious, paper-driven fixes. But they were the spine of what would keep rights from being optional. Small things changed first. Time cards were scanned into a shared system, pay stubs matched entries, a hotline number appeared on breakroom boards, a line that would route to an independent HR representative who did not report directly to the building management. For Juliana, those adjustments arrived like weather reports that finally matched the forecast. Her pay for 1 week came with a corrected amount. It was not a fortune, but it was the difference between skipping a bus and paying for one, between stretching a grocery bag into an extra meal or not. She kept photocopies of everything, tucking them into the folder that held her diploma. Hope remained cautious. Experience had taught her the world was easy to revert to habit, but practical changes eased some weight. And then, as if the city enjoyed testing its new alignments, a new emergency struck. It was 3 a.m. when the first drip woke Juliana. She lay very still, listening to the sound like a small metronome, a single water bead that somewhere above her head had found a root. She cursed softly, moved to a light, and saw the wet stain spreading across the ceiling like a slow bruise. She scrambled for buckets. The girls' room was quiet. Luna and Sophia slept on in a tired, trusting heap. She called her aunt, who offered a neighbour's help and the promise of temporary shelter, but the ceiling began to give way in spite of plans. A crack widened, and with a muffled shudder, The plaster collapsed into the kitchen, sending dust and water across the floor. The bed shook as if it had been jarred. Panic compressed into a single urgent voice at the foot of the phone. The property manager's number was busy. The emergency investigator was mired in another call. Juliana did the math in half words. Buckets, phone calls, frantic sweeps to gather clothes for the children. For a parent, the arithmetic of disaster is always immediate. Where do we sleep tonight? Who will watch the children while I work? How will I explain this to my daughters without making them feel like refugees? She called the number she had written down that one strange night after the bed incident. Ricardo's building had age and weight to its bureaucracy, but the man who sat above it had, she had learned, ears for practical emergencies. She hesitated only a second, and then pressed call. Ricardo answered on the third ring. Sleep was not immediate to him anymore. His nights had turned into a long second shift of attention. Juliana? His voice held the careful disbelief of someone who had not expected to be called at that hour for anything but corporate crises. My ceiling just collapsed, she said. Her words were brittle with adrenaline. The girls! There's water everywhere. I don't know what to do. He did not ask whether she was sure. He did not weigh the reputational cost of an overnight response. He heard the urgency and began moving. He contacted the building's maintenance contractor and his own on-call structural team within minutes, dictating addresses and a list of supplies. He called the apartment company that managed his portfolio and pushed for an immediate inspection. He authorized emergency funds. He asked his assistant to have a van on site within the hour and to arrange temporary lodging if necessary. When he arrived at dawn, he found Juliana standing in a kitchen that had been ransacked by water and gravity, her hair pinned back with a pencil, skin grey with fatigue but eyes sharp. Luna and Sophia stood clinging to their aunt in the hallway, their pyjamas damp. The drywall dust hung in the air like a thin fog. The smell of wet plaster and damp clothing filled the space, ordinary and small and devastating. Ricardo did not step into an offer of charity. He spoke in short, precise sentences. We'll get this repaired today, he said. I'll arrange temporary housing and pay for the repairs. We'll document everything. There was a practicality to his voice, less a hand extended from above than a mechanism being started. I'll have someone help with the girls if you need it. Juliana listened. Her first inclination was to refuse. Pride had taught her to refuse first and calculate later. But the children clutched at her skirt, and there were no safe nights in a ceiling that might continue to yield. She agreed to let the team assess the damage and to accept immediate lodging for the family while repairs were determined. I don't want your pity, she said quietly. Just the ceiling fixed and a plan. Her words were a negotiation, sharp and deliberate. The paperwork began in earnest. The maintenance team filed an incident report. Ricardo insisted on a complete record, photographs, invoices, estimates, a written timeline. He ordered that the repairs be conducted by licensed contractors with full receipts and a guarantee of work. He asked his legal team to draft a housing agreement for temporary accommodation, corporate funded, but with a clause that it was not a gift. Rather, it was a formal, time-limited alternative housing arrangement provided to ensure a safe environment while necessary repairs were undertaken. The reconstruction stretched over weeks. Workers cordoned the kitchen off with plastic sheeting, reinforced a weakened joist, installed a temporary ceiling, and patched wiring that had been soaked. The girls were enrolled in a daycare while the dust settled, the costs covered by a small emergency stipend Ricardo authorized through his office. The repair invoices arrived neat and itemized. Each item was signed and stored in Juliana's folder. The movement from chaos to order was bureaucratic. It left little room for grand speeches, but it preserved shelter. After the dust settled, Ricardo asked to speak to Juliana privately. He did not come with a check handed over in an envelope or a begging speech about his capacity to fix everything. He came with a formal proposition, a job offer, in writing. The position he proposed was not a vague, "we'll help you," that some wealthy benefactors trot out for their photo ops. It was a job aligned with her degree, a junior administrative coordinator role within one of his property management offices, with a clear job description, a salary that significantly exceeded her current combined earnings, a 6-month probationary period, paid training, and a possibility of progression. He included a housing option, a corporate residency program the company was piloting, designed to provide stable living for staff who worked in repair and building services, with a 12-month lease and maintenance clause. Included in the package were childcare assistance, transport stipends, a formal grievance mechanism in HR, and an exit clause with a severance equal to 3 months' pay should employment end for reasons beyond performance. He placed the offer on the small kitchen table like a piece of architecture. The paper had letterhead, a list of responsibilities, a salary figure, probation terms, and a clause that emphasized independence. Any private relationships between employees and senior management must be disclosed to HR and would be governed by a transfer option to avoid conflicts of interest. It also stipulated that the job was not a favour and that all standard hiring procedures, interviews, references, background checks, would apply. Juliana read it once, then again. Each clause landed like a brick that might build a safer house. Her fingers trembled not from excitement, but from the fatigue of measurement. Was this a step forward, or a step that would bind her to an obligation that might later be weaponized? She took the offer home. She did not sign that day. Decisions of that scale are rarely made on the spur of gratitude alone. Juliana met Beat in the small cafe across from the bus terminal, slid the envelope across the table, and watched as her friend read, lips moving with every line. Beat's eyes flicked to the salary number, and then to the clauses about housing and childcare. She frowned at the clause that required disclosure of any private relationship. For Beat it read like a protection, but also as a reminder that power could warp even clear intentions. "Make them put everything in writing," Beat said. "Ask for a clause that if anything changes here, it's HR who decides relocation, not one person. Make sure you can opt out, and ask for a written promise on the childcare." Juliana listened, and asked for a copy to take to her aunt and to a lawyer friend who offered pro bono advice. She read the offer with the methodical care she had applied to household budgets for years. She negotiated, short emails, a meeting in HR office, a precise list of demands. Her priorities were not sentimental. She wanted a salary that accounted for the loss of time she would incur relocating, an explicit childcare stipend for after-school care, a guaranteed training program that would lead to a recognised certification, and an ironclad clause that her employment would be independent of any personal association with the building's ownership. HR responded with a formal revised contract. It added a probation schedule with defined performance metrics, quarterly review commitments, and a clause allowing transfer to another building if an actual conflict of interest was declared. The housing agreement was changed to a standard corporate lease with a 12-month minimum and a clause that guaranteed maintenance response times. Importantly, an independent ombudsperson was added to the process, a third-party advocate for staff concerns, not part of the building's internal hierarchy. Only after every item Juliana requested was written into the contract did she sign. She negotiated benefit details the way she had negotiated prices at markets for years, by knowing what she needed and refusing to accept token gestures. The moment she signed it, she did not feel rescued. She felt settled into a formal arrangement that acknowledged, on paper and in process, her autonomy. She accepted the job because it was work she could do, and because it removed much of the precariousness that had defined her late nights. Ricardo, as a figure in the company, remained appropriately distant. He did not move to make her special within the workplace. Policy dictated the hire. HR conducted the interview. References were checked. Training was scheduled. Ricardo's role was to sign off on the budget and to ensure the housing program would be funded. He insisted privately that HR handle any matters of workplace relationships, and he agreed to the clause that would require transfer rather than secrecy if their relationship shifted into the personal realm. He did not ask for Juliana's gratitude, and he avoided moments of paternalism. When they spoke, it was with the tacit recognition that the power differential required humility and vigilance. Months passed with the steady, unromantic labour of integration. Juliana commuted less and slept more. Training classes gave her practical tools, software for tracking maintenance requests, customer service protocols, a certificate in basic facilities management. She learnt to draft memos and to read maintenance bids without being overwhelmed by jargon. The work respected her degree, and she increasingly began to see a path beyond cleaning. The job carried a clearer identity, a title she could present at school meetings and in her children's eyes. "My mum works at the property office." The simple dignity of that sentence mattered. At the office, relationships were cautious at first. Some co-workers were openly sceptical. Staff who thought she had been promoted due to an unusual patron had to be confronted with records, signed audits, and HR policies that documented every step. Renata, who had been both colleague and chain of command, adjusted. She and Juliana had a careful conversation about boundaries and mutual respect. Renata admitted embarrassment at how things had been managed, and to her credit, began to advocate internally for better training and clearer job descriptions. The company started a small career path program that offered training slots for cleaning staff who wanted to move into administration. Juliana's presence in the office became a visible example that such shifts were possible. Romance, when it appeared, did so with the guardedness of two people aware of the stakes. For months it did not exist as romance at all, only as proximity, a polite conversation in the hallway, a shared cup of coffee over a budget review, the exchange of small courtesies. Ricardo kept his distance in public. He met Juliana's children in neutral spaces organised by the company, a community picnic sponsored by his foundation, a free dental clinic for staff children, a group visit to a municipal park. Consent was consistent and explicit. When Ricardo suggested many weeks later that they have coffee after a work meeting, he asked HR for guidance and offered to meet in a public cafe. Juliana accepted because she wanted to, not because she felt obliged. Their private conversations were slow and careful. They spoke about the city, about their working days, about the small probabilities of happiness. He learned to listen without assuming he had the authority to fix everything. She learned that he could be kind without expecting gratitude as currency. There were afternoons when they compared notes about policy changes, and evenings when she told him about Luna's science fair and Sophia's stubborn attempt at a new word. They shared no illusions. Both understood the power dynamics that hovered like the city's humidity. They named the imbalance openly and worked to mitigate it. Transparency as practice, not platitude. Neighbours watched with curiosity. Some residents resented the changes. Patricia Mendez and others grunted at the new norms that asked them to behave with a minimum of decency. The company fielded complaints and used them to craft a tenant code of conduct that clarified expectations. No humiliation, no demands of staff beyond reasonable requests, penalties for abusive behaviour. Enforcement was bureaucratic, an odd kind of justice that depended on memos and fines rather than morals. It was imperfect, but it was something beyond the old status quo. The slow building of trust had its setbacks. There were moments when Juliana, exhausted, reverted to her old deference, smiling a little too eagerly, apologising when she had done nothing wrong. There were residents who made carefully veiled comments, and co-workers who misread her quiet for complacency. One afternoon, a maintenance contractor balked at documenting an expense. Juliana flagged it, and the audit found a small misallocation. There was embarrassment and an apology. Systems corrected themselves with paper and signatures. The changes were never cinematic, but they were real. Outside of work, life stabilised in incremental ways. Juliana had a small apartment in a building connected to the company's staff housing programme. It was modest but private. The lease placed maintenance responsibilities on the company for structural issues, and rent was subsidised at a rate that allowed her to save a small emergency fund. She bought, for the first time in years without borrowing, a new pair of shoes for Sophia and a notebook for Luna's spelling homework. The girls began attending an after-school programme paid for in part by the childcare stipend. Nights were calmer. The fear of sudden eviction receded into the background like a remembered illness. Months into the job, the city seemed less like an enemy and more like a set of possibilities. Juliana took a course offered through the company's education fund that focused on small business bookkeeping. She began to imagine something beyond being employed, perhaps one day running a small cleaning business that trained other women to move into administration. The idea had the quiet pulse of a dream that had been pried open. Their private life developed the way two cautious plants might share the same window, growing toward light, but keeping roots separate. They began to meet outside the office with intentionality. A Saturday morning at a park where Luna and Sophia chased pigeons, a simple dinner at a family-friendly restaurant where the conversation was mostly about school holidays and the recipes their aunts used to make. Ricardo introduced himself to the children with the restraint of a man learning to be part of a family without forcing himself into it. He bought Luna a small telescope after she mentioned stars in a science project, and he brought Sophia a lunchbox with a superhero pattern she adored. The gifts were simple and practical, not attempts to buy affection. There were moments of awkwardness. At a playground, a neighbour whispered a judgment as if they were watching soap opera. Juliana ignored it, focusing on the girls' shrieks and smiles. She noticed how much easier it was to watch them play when sleep was no longer rationed. Ricardo, who had once defined wealth by assets and address, watched the way the children interacted with the cityscape, their laughter against the sour memory of late-night meetings that once swallowed his attention. He could not unmake his past. He could, however, rearrange his present. One evening, months after the ceiling had collapsed, and after papers had been signed and training certificates framed, they had a small dinner at Juliana's apartment. It was a quiet thing. Grilled cheese sandwiches, Luna's drawings taped to the refrigerator, the hum of the city outside the window. They spoke less about policy and more about small daily things, how Juliana liked her coffee, how Ricardo's mother had once kept a garden on the balcony of a small apartment in a different part of the city. There were pauses designed to let both of them show small tenderness without rushing. In that room, there was nothing dramatic, no dramatic declaration, no sudden change, but the ordinary intimacy of shared routines, which is often a more reliable proof of belonging than thunderous romance. As their relationship moved from public caution to private proximity, they continued to be careful. When Ricardo began to feel a new tenderness that might have been called love by another vocabulary, he asked for counsel from his own therapist and from HR about managing the inevitable conflicts of interest. They instituted an additional layer of separation. Whenever any meeting concerned Juliana's career or housing, Henrique, the independent ombudsperson, was present to ensure that both rights and obligations were clear. The company added a clause to their internal code that any personal relationship involving a senior manager and a subordinate required an impartial mediation process to be followed should disputes ever arise. These processes were not romantic, they were governance. But governance was a form of moral care in the kind of world they inhabited. The community around them changed slowly too. Other companies on Ricardo's roster took notice. A small network of property managers began to share best practices for payroll transparency and staff development. Local press occasionally covered the story, but the articles focused more on policies than personalities, an outcome Ricardo preferred. Patricia Mendez continued to host events and occasionally sniffed at the new protocols. Her network of friends made occasional petitions for common sense. Yet fewer people knelt to make a party look clean than before. More guests were reminded that dignity was not optional. The richest reward for Juliana, though, did not come from policy wins or from the formal acknowledgements of her new title. It came in the quiet accumulation of ordinary mornings, Luna reading aloud at breakfast, while Juliana packed a lunch with a calm hand, the small ritual of walking the children to school without the fear of being late from an unexpected shift. It came in the careful presence of a manager who listened and learned to be useful without claiming to save anyone. It came in the comfort of a roof that did not leak and a job that did not compromise her sense of self. Ricardo found himself transformed not by a single sweep of mercy, but by the mundane moral labour of accountability. Late at night on his balcony, he would watch the city and no longer revel only in how much he had built. He started to think of his properties as obligations in the literal sense, tasks that required maintenance, not just of pipes and plaster, but of human relationships. He would imagine a ledger that included the weight of a mother's working hours, the small indignities removed by a signed memo, the ways a child's homework is more likely to be done when a parent is not exhausted. There were small stubborn residues to which neither reform nor affection provided instant remedy. Some residents never adjusted. A few contractors attempted to flatten the new processes with old tricks. There were nights when Juliana learned of petty abuses and went to HR to insist on a review. There were times when Ricardo received calls from investors asking him why his buildings were more expensive to run. He explained the moral calculus that had, over time, made the occupation of his towers less profitable in the short term, but more durable in the long term. He had tired of easy profit at the expense of human cost. The story of their lives, once started by a shock, eased into its long middle, boring at times, deeply human at others. The company's career path program slowly expanded. Renata, once hesitant, became a proponent for internal promotion and oversaw a mentorship circle that Juliana co-led. Bet took a short course in bookkeeping and began helping friends with tax forms. Jorge enrolled in a vocational retraining program and, ironically, later applied to a job in facilities management at a different firm. These were not miracles, they were repairs. The culminating domestic scene arrived with a kind of quiet finality. On a Sunday morning, Ricardo met Juliana and the girls at a municipal park. Luna ran ahead, telescope strap bouncing on her back, shouting she had seen a tiny man with a kite. Sophia held Juliana's hand like a very small person anchoring herself. They sat on a bench and watched the city open its arms. There was no announcement, no grand merging of families. There was a picnic of sandwiches and juice boxes, a kite that refused at first to fly and then soared, and the small domestic choreography of laughter and minor complaints about ants. Ricardo taught the girls to fold the kite when wind tired, and they taught him the names of the clouds. In that ordinary practice, the idea of family did not declare itself by an instant. It accumulated. Later, on Juliana's balcony, her own, not the penthouse, Ricardo stood with a mug of coffee while Luna spread her drawings across the small table. The city was a patchwork of roofs and a long river of headlights. He watched them with a new kind of calculation, projecting not in profits, but in days his daughters would have in school, in safe rides home, in a future where Juliana's degree might finally be a credential in practice rather than a relic. He had spent a lifetime placing value in material things. Now he measured wealth differently. He could not undo the past harms his business had enabled, nor should he imagine that signing a few memos erased 2 decades of practice. But he could commit to the labour of consistent, accountable repair. She looked at him, and then, as if reading a line of a text they had written together over time, she said, "I didn't want to be rescued. I wanted a door that would let me walk through it on my own." He nodded. "And you did. You still do." They had arrived at an equilibrium that was workable and honest, a slow partnership of equals in the ways that mattered most. They celebrated small anniversaries of safety, 1 year since the ceiling collapsed, 1 year since the first HR memo, and each marked with a simple gesture: a cake shared with co-workers, a stack of certificates placed on a shelf, a child's drawing hung in a frame. When the story needed closure, it did not come as thunder. It came as daily things done with intention. The company continued to refine its policies. Residents adjusted. Juliana kept moving forward in her career, eventually taking classes in management and mentoring other staff who hoped to make similar transitions. Ricardo kept learning to listen. Sometimes he failed, and sometimes he apologized. The ledger of his life still held losses, but they were now the kind of losses that made room for other people's gains. There were no cinematic absolutions. The city remained complicated, full of grit and bright possibility. But there was a new pattern. Individual dignity mattered in the sum of decisions, and formal systems, when designed and enforced with care, could protect it. On the balcony one evening, with the skyline turning violet, Ricardo placed a small blanket around the girls and watched them argue over whose drawing was the best. Juliana stood beside him, one hand on his arm, the other gently smoothing a stray lock of Luna's hair. He had once believed accumulation to be the principal measure of a life well lived. The arithmetic had changed. He now counted mornings where children were safe, contracts that were honoured, and the quiet, unremarkable routine of people who had enough. The title that had once been a shock, the man who told his staff to leave the woman asleep in his bed, changed its centre of gravity. The shocking command became a hinge. It was not the entirety of what he became, it was the opening that allowed a different trajectory. That night of surprise did not redeem every failure. It simply offered a moment where someone with power chose, erringly and imperfectly, to act differently. The rest was work. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes dignity matters, and subscribe for more stories about ordinary courage and human change.